Assalamu alaikum to you all. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I don't disrupt your schedule too much. I just wanted to make sure that I'm kind of able to share with you a few ideas here. And I'm going to ask you some questions as we go along. I know it takes a lot to answer because everybody's afraid of like being wrong and kind of looking foolish or silly. I've taught thousands of medical students, without exaggeration. I've taught hundreds of medical residents. So I know that that's like an instinct. I'm going to ask you to try to break that instinct. I try to be wrong at least 3 times a day, because if I'm not wrong, that means I'm not learning, right? If I get every question I'm asked right, I haven't learned anything. I already know it. So set the example, be brave, be wrong, maybe be right. That's wonderful. So how did the universe start? Anybody? Yes. The Big Bang, right? Yes. Okay. The Big Bang. How we're going to talk about what is the Big Bang and why am I here to talk about the Big Bang? How long do you think we've believed in the Big Bang? 50 years. That's excellent. Okay. So you're 2 for 2. That's wonderful.
Okay.
No, you're absolutely right. About 50 years. So why am I here to talk about the Big Bang? The reason I'm here to talk about the Big Bang is that you will have heard or you will hear as you sort of go through. Who here is in high school? Can you raise your hands for me? Anybody here post-high school, after high school? Raise your hands. College, great. After college, wonderful. You will hear or you will have heard that science sort of is anti-God. That science gives us the message that we don't really need the idea of God. That the idea of God and religion and that God created the universe, that's for primitive minds who haven't been, advanced enough to understand that it's really scientific laws and rules that govern all of these things. And that it's only primitive minds that kind of cling to religion and people who are afraid that when they die, that's it. And so they make up these myths, like the ancient creation myths of the Norse and the Vikings and the ancient Egyptians. And the people who are very charitable are going to tell you, well, science isn't anti-God, but they're just totally different things. Science has nothing to do with God. Well, the last 50 years have actually given us a completely different message. That science has now gotten to a point that it can weigh in very strongly on the age-old question, does God exist or not? And a lot of Muslim youth and Christian youth and Jewish youth are very conflicted by the message they get that if I'm going to be an advanced scientific sort of person, how can I also believe in these ideas that God created the universe? Well, Islam tells us that in the creation of the heavens and the earth, this is a verse from the Qur'an, there are signs for those endowed with insight. And the Big Bang is one of those biggest signs, and it is very significant in the debate about does God exist or not. And right now, there's a struggle between 2 philosophies. One is theism. Theism means belief in God, okay? The other is what's called scientific materialism. Materialism doesn't mean that they love money and they're greedy and all of that. What scientific materialism is an idea that there's just matter and energy and nothing else exists. There is no such thing as God. There's no such thing as a soul. There's no such thing as a supernatural. And there is this debate. In the old days, has anybody here heard of Isaac Newton? Does that name ring any bells, right? He's the 2nd greatest physicist who's ever lived. Who's the 1st greatest physicist? Einstein, right? That's why you hear people, you say to somebody who's really smart, you say, hey, Einstein. You never hear anybody say, hey, Newton, right? Okay, because Einstein was the smartest. Everybody says Newton was the 2nd. People like Isaac Newton believed that when you looked at all of these physical laws that kind of governed the heavens, the slide here is not changing. I don't know why. I am seeing a slide that you are not seeing. So let me try to fix that. Now, while somebody tries to fix it. My wife is a tech genius here, so hopefully she can fix it. But in any case, Isaac Newton, Galileo, all of these greats of science believed that you look at the heavens, you can see the signs of God, just like the Qur'an says. Then we get to the 1800s. We get Charles Darwin and evolution. Evolution is saying you don't need God to create a very finely tuned eye that can see light and an ear that can hear all sorts of frequencies. Evolution does that. And a man named Laplace, very famous scientist. If you study advanced math, you will run into something called the Laplace equation, the Laplace series, an operation in math called the Laplace series. He writes a book called Celestial Mechanics using the laws of Newton that basically show how Newton's laws can explain how the sun, has the Earth orbiting it, and the orbit is very precise and all this. And Napoleon reads this book of Laplace, and he says to Laplace, "You didn't mention God." And Laplace tells him, "Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis." So that was where we were in about 1850, all the way until the late 1900s. I was born in the 1960s. I know all of you were born after the year 2000, but until about the year 2000, the idea of Laplace that science doesn't need the idea of God. Then discoveries of the last 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, even 10 years ago are showing that no, the pendulum is swinging back. Science is very, very supportive. In fact, almost proves that there is no way that this universe could have just been accidental the way this scientific materialism says, that it's just matter and energy, and by accident, the universe and its laws arose. That becomes impossible, okay? And that is why the Big Bang is so important. Let me go ahead. So you're gonna run into some hard things in this talk. I want to give you my favorite quote from Einstein: "The things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler." So I'm going to try to make them as simple as possible, but no simpler. So here are the laws of Newton. This is how he explained gravity. He said that you can have this equation and it tells you why the Earth orbits the sun. Okay, forget about the equation. The idea is he has an equation and it tells you how the Earth moves around the sun. But there was one problem with it. Does anybody know what that problem was? That's a really hard question. But even Newton himself knew there was a problem. He came up with an equation that very precisely predicted when there would be an eclipse and when, the Earth would be here and when the Earth would be there. And we still use those equations when you send up a satellite or a space station. But there was a problem. The problem is gravity is a force, right? It causes my glasses to fall. It causes an apple to fall from a tree. But all the forces we know, something has to push or pull, right? If I want to move this chair, it's not me. How do I make it move? I have to touch. I have to push. So if the sun is pulling the Earth and keeping it in check, rotating around with the force of gravity, but there's empty space between the sun and the Earth. There's no force. The Earth isn't tied on a string and you're swinging around the sun. How can that happen? Okay? And that was a big problem with Newton's theory. Newton couldn't figure it out. And he said, I know these laws work, but I just took this part, I'm going to leave to the imagination of the reader, because I can't figure it out. For 500 years, nobody could figure it out. Okay, well, 500, maybe 400. Nobody could figure it out. Then along comes who? Along comes Einstein. And he says, I figured it out. It's not that there's this invisible force. I have a totally radical idea. Gravity is not a force. Gravity is that big masses like the sun actually curve space. People say, Einstein, what do you mean curve space? What does that even mean? He said space is a thing, and it can be moved and twisted and curved. Just like the surface of this beanbag here, okay? If I sit on it, it curves, right? My weight curves. So think about a trampoline. Anybody here ever jumped on a trampoline? If I take a trampoline and I roll a marble across the trampoline, it'll just roll from side to side. Now imagine I put a bowling ball on the trampoline. It's going to make the trampoline sag. If I then scoot that marble on the trampoline, that marble is going to start to spin around the bowling ball because the bowling ball has curved the trampoline. That's what the sun does. It curves space. And that's why the Earth orbits the sun. There's no force. The sun isn't pulling the Earth. The sun is curving space. And so it makes the Earth spin around the sun. And then Einstein put a whole bunch of equations to show that this is right. And that was his big idea. And he puts in these equations. Oh, there it is. Okay. These are Einstein's equations. And I know you didn't come here to see a bunch of math equations, okay? But I just wanted to show them to you. The stuff on the left here tells us how, yes, ma'am, yes, question.
Yeah, I was wondering, doesn't Qur'an like prove Einstein's like theory?
Wonderful, we'll get there. Yes, a very significant question. Thank you. So this stuff here tells space how to curve, and this stuff on the right side of the equation is saying that matter and energy are what makes space curve. And this looks like it's one equation. It's actually 16 equations, but they're kind of packaged all together neatly in what's known as the Einstein notation. I know I'm saying stuff that you're not interested in hearing, but bear with me. An equation is different than a solution, okay? Let's say I come and tell you the way the world works. I'm going to give you the equation for how the world works. And that equation is that x plus 7 equals 12. And that equation tells us how the world works. What is x? 5. Thank you. Whoever said 5. Yes. That's the solution to the equation. So Einstein comes up with the equation. He says this is how matter like the sun and energy curve space. And the proof of that, by the way, that space curves is that light bends. When we think of light, like you take one of those green lasers or something and shoot it against the wall, it goes straight. But it turns out that if you have something massive like the sun, it actually makes light bend. How do I know that in our world light doesn't bend? Because I can't see around a corner. If I stood in that room inside there, you couldn't see me unless you walk it, because light won't bend around the corner, get into your eyes. But sound waves bend, because I could talk from that room and you'd hear it, okay? But it actually turns out that light does bend if there's a big object. So, Einstein's equations were proven right over and over. But before you can do that, you have to solve the equation. Somebody has to say 5. The answer is 5. So Einstein comes up with the equation, 16 equations, and there's something known. Anybody here in college studied differential equations? Anybody ever heard that word, differential equations? Okay, well, these are not just differential equations, they're partial differential equations, they're nonlinear partial differential equations, and there are 16 of them that all have to be satisfied at the same time. It's like a combination lock. We're getting the first number on the dial doesn't do it for you. You have to get all the numbers right. So it is insanely difficult to solve. So Einstein doesn't solve it. He just says, here's the equation that tells us how the world works. Then along comes a Catholic priest named Lemaitre and says to Einstein, I've solved your equations. And guess what? They tell us that the universe is expanding. That it's not just sitting there like a bowling ball on a trampoline, that space itself is actually expanding. And Einstein says to Lemaitre, your math may be right, but your physics is abominable. You have no idea what you're talking about. Then another guy named Friedman solves Einstein's equations, reaches the same conclusion. Says there's no way the universe can be static. Does anybody know what static means? What is static? Not moving, it doesn't change, okay? And that is what the ancients had thought since Aristotle and Plato, that the universe is eternal, it has always been there, it is perfect, it doesn't change. There's no such thing as the universe is expanding or contracting. And this was absolute, any educated person, like today, what do we consider every educated person, for example, knows that the earth is round, right? You can figure that maybe somebody very primitive, grew up, never went to school, and yeah, I'm not knocking anyone like that. I mean, they just never had the opportunity. You can understand that some people could think that the earth is flat, right? You go out, you look down Vermont Avenue, the earth doesn't look round, it looks flat. But we now believe that every educated person knows that the earth is really round, right? Same thing. The belief was that every single educated person knows that the universe is static. The universe doesn't change. There's no such thing as the universe expanding and contracting. But Einstein comes up with his equations. When they solve the equations, they tell him, your equations are saying the universe is expanding. Einstein says, no, something is off here. You guys have messed something up. The universe is not expanding, because even somebody as smart as Einstein couldn't break tradition. He couldn't break 2,000 years of thinking that the universe is static and it's always been there. Now, why is this idea that the universe has always been there important for atheists? Let's say you're an atheist and you don't believe in God. Having the universe always be there means you don't need a creator, right? Because you don't need to ask the question, how did the universe get here? It's always here. And it's a logical way to think, because when somebody asks, how did you get here? And say, well, my parents got married, they had me. How did they get here? Their parents got married, they had them. You can trace it all the way back up to a certain point, but at a certain point, there has to be a first cause, what philosophers call a first cause. And we, as people of faith, believe that God is the first cause. I can ask about any person, how did they get here? Somebody says, well, who made God? Has anybody ever asked you that question? You say, this person made this person made, well, then who made God? And what's our answer? God has always been there. Nobody made God. God is the first cause. It is God that's always been there, and he makes everything. You can do that with the universe. You can make the universe the first cause. The universe has always been there, and it doesn't need an explanation. And that was everybody's thinking. Now, that was a problem for people of faith, because the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Qur'an says, in the creation of the heavens and the earth. So there was this tension, this conflict. How do I, as a religious person, say, well, I'm an educated person, and I have to believe what every educated person believes, that the universe is static, it doesn't change, it's always been there. So people were having a hard time with this. And then, now let's get back to our story. So to his dismay, and these are quotes from, some of the leading physicists around, to his dismay, Einstein found that the field equations of general relativity for his model have no static solution. If you solve Einstein's equations, there's no way the universe could be static, unchanged. And the realization that the universe must be dynamic profoundly disturbed Einstein. He had naturally assumed that the universe must be static and eternal. That's what every educated person thought, even somebody as bright as Einstein who could think outside the box. Then, 10 years later, Einstein publishes his general theory of relativity in between 1915 and 1919. Okay, so that's about 100 years ago. 10 years after, okay, what's going on here? Let's go back. Okay, so it is still, all right, let's go here. 10 years after that, a man named Edwin Hubble, an astronomer, has a powerful enough telescope. He starts looking at galaxies. Has anybody heard of the Hubble telescope in the news? Anybody heard of that term, Hubble? Okay, anyway, very famous astronomer. He looks at the galaxies and he discovers, now this isn't theory anymore. This isn't somebody solving equations. This is somebody looking like, I look here and I say, hey, that's, Brother Hassan Zini. It's direct observation. Discovers that the universe is expanding. Okay? And people look at his data and they say, oh my gosh, Hubble is right. The universe is expanding. So 2,000 years of thinking that the universe is static and unchanging come crashing down. Because now you can't argue. first, you look at the star is there, it was there 10 years ago, it was there when my grandfather was born. If the universe, why aren't I seeing the stars spreading apart? But Hubble showed that if you look far enough out there, the universe is expanding. And there's no way to argue with that anymore. So what does Einstein do? Well, before Hubble came along, people had told Einstein, your solutions say that the universe must be expanding. So he goes, no, no, no. I know it seems my equations say that. I'm going to put in this extra thing in the equations. Can you just see the difference between the top and the bottom? Do you see that this part here isn't up there? That's all I'm asking you to do. Can you see that? This is known as the cosmological constant. It was kind of a fudge factor. Einstein throws it into his equations to force the solutions to be standard. Okay? Because people tell him when you solve the equations, they say the universe has to be expanding. So he throws this in there and he says, okay, solve them now. So they solve them now and they say, okay, now the universe is static. This fudge factor that you threw in gives us static solutions. So Einstein is happy. He says, see, I told you. I just had forgotten to put this in there, neglected to put this in there, but now you can see my equations say the universe is static. Then, a few years later, Hubble comes along and shows the universe is expanding. So Einstein goes back and he says, okay, I was wrong. The universe is expanding. This cosmological constant, that was the biggest mistake of my life. And he realized that if he had just listened to what his equations said, he could have discovered just on theoretical grounds that the universe was expanding. I'm trying to bring across to you that this was one of the most important discoveries in 2,000 years. I know you guys may take it for granted or may think it's not important. This was revolutionary, just isn't a big enough word. This is like somebody discovering extraterrestrials. This is like somebody first discovering that the earth is round, not flat. This was just a bombshell. And Einstein missed his chance to be the one who discovered it from his equations. He said that cosmological constant that I tried to patch things up with and make the universe seem static, that's the biggest mistake of my life. So why am I going through all this? So finally, everybody accepts that the universe is expanding. Einstein was wrong. The universe is expanding. And this is what Stephen Hawking, he's a very famous physicist in the wheelchair. Does anybody recognize that guy, the guy with ALS, who, talks with the computer? It's one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. And he says the discovery of the expansion of the universe was one of the great intellectual revolutions of the 20th century. Came as a total surprise and changed the discussion of the origin of the universe. And Einstein called the cosmological constant my biggest one. Before we go on, I want you to look at this verse in the Qur'an. وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. And it is we who have built the universe with power, and verily it is we who are steadily expanding it. So the Qur'an, 1,500 years before all of this, said very clearly the universe is expanding. Went against everything any educated person believed. And I am very glad I live now, because if I lived in 1900, if I was, alive 100 years ago only, not right now, I as a Muslim wouldn't have known what to do here. Because the Quran is telling me the universe is expanding, but all educated people, all scientists, even Einstein, say no, the universe is static and it doesn't change and it doesn't expand. So this verse is a miracle, no less than that. There is no way that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who could not read, who could not write, could have come up with this, because it went against the grain. And it also says that it is the power, the energy that is making the universe expand. And now that is what is believed. It is the energy of the Big Bang and the what's known as the energy of the vacuum of space that is causing the universe to expand. So the Qur'an, when you ask me, does the Qur'an show that Einstein was right? Yes, Einstein's theory said the universe would be expanding, and the Qur'an said that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding because of an energy or a power that is in the universe. Okay, now that we've established that, let's say the universe is expanding. We'll like fireworks when they go off and they spread all over. Okay, so let's say the universe is here now and it's expanding. 10 years from now, where will it be? Here, right? It'll be bigger, like a balloon being blown up. But I'm not interested in the future. Let's go backwards in time. If it's here now, where was it, say, 1 million years ago? Here, right? Because now it's here. A while ago, it was here because it's expanding. Let's go back further. Here. Let's go back further. Here. Let's go back further. Here. If you go all the way back, it has to be a single point, right? I mean, if you take it all the way back to the origin, it's a single point. And it is that single point that is what's known as the singularity, right? That in physics speak, the singularity is the single point that exploded into the Big Bang. And I know the picture you're going to have in your minds is that there's this empty space and this Big Bang exploded and all the matter came out. That's not right. There was no space. That explosion produced space, and it produced all the matter that's inside space. Space did not exist. Nothing existed. Because Einstein shows us space as a thing. It's a thing that curves. It's just invisible to us. So when you follow it all the way back, there's a single point, and it is that single point that is the singularity and the Big Bang. And what Stephen Hawking said, that Einstein's general theory of relativity implied that the universe and time itself must have had a beginning in a tremendous explosion. What does that mean? That means, why is this important to us as people of religion? Because it means that the universe is not eternal. The universe had a beginning, just like the Bible said, just like the Qur'an said, right? And if it has a beginning, that beginning must have a cause. There must have been a creator. Now, we can't say, well, they're logically equivalent. The universe is the first cause, God is the first. Well, the universe is not the first cause. The universe wasn't always there. And now this is scientifically proven. There is no debate about the Big Bang. And the other verse I want to point out, by the way, is, are they then those who are bent on denying the truth, not aware that the heavens and the earth were one single entity which we parted asunder? أَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. A lot of scholars today interpret this verse as evidence of the Big Bang. Everything was together, and we tore it apart. فَتَقْنَاهُمَا in Arabic doesn't mean, yes, I will get to you in 1 second. Doesn't mean that we kind of gently pull them apart. It means we violently rip them apart. When you look at ancient creation myths, I'm talking about, the Vikings, the ancient Egyptians. You never have the idea that everything was together and then out of that came all the different things. You have that the blood of this ancient being became the rivers. You have that the head became the earth and the foot became this. This idea that there was a single unity is also a very new idea. It's not as revolutionary maybe as the expansion of the universe, but I just want to show you that there's a lot of really neat stuff in the Quran. But fataqa means, ratqa means that they were together. They're a single entity. I'm sorry, you had a question. Forgive me. I almost forgot. That's a very interesting question. That point, you can actually make a point so small that it does not take up, its size becomes zero. And that's sort of the miracle of it, is that there was no space. It was a single point of zero size. And that's why the laws of physics break down there. Because if we're going to do any physics, we need some space. That's why they call it a singularity, because it's actually a point of zero size, and no one kind of can understand what that even means. Yes?
two questions.
Yes.
What is asunder mean? Asunder, it says.
Oh, asunder means apart.
Oh,
So if I take something and tear it asunder, it means I violently rip it apart. And I'm trying to bring across to you this notion that the Big Bang was a violent explosion. And the Quran is giving us the idea that it wasn't that this thing was gently created here and this thing was gently created here. Everything was together and it was violently ripped apart. Okay, so the English expression would be torn asunder.
okay,
Yeah.
the second question.
Yes.
Did nobody back then like come to like the conclusion with the Quran? Because like the Quran says that like everything has an ending, right?
Mhm.
So if we came to the conclusion that the universe was something that started, doesn't that mean it has an end too? Did anyone come to that conclusion back then?
Back then, yes, I mean, we believe that the day of judgment would be that, but that was the tension between being an educated person where everybody believed that the universe was dead. It was always there and it would always be there. But the Quran tells you it has a beginning, it has an end, and even worse for you back then as a believing Muslim, that it's expanding. You're saying, okay, I'm a believer, I believe in the word of God, but science is telling me that what am I going to do? And I'm saying, alhamdulillah, we don't live then because I don't know what I would have done. Thank God I live then. Huh?
Did nobody try to prove it? And there was
Oh, well, the math just wasn't there. It took until Einstein to come up with these equations. Even somebody as smart as Newton couldn't prove it. Right? Yeah. Okay, so now, did people accept this idea easily? No, they didn't, because you had 2,000 years of thinking one way, actually 2,500, 3,000 years of thinking one way. All of a sudden, Einstein's equations come along. All of a sudden, Hubble and his telescope come along, and they say the universe is expanding. Well, if you run that movie backward, there must have been a Big Bang. And the whole term Big Bang, by the way, what we call it today, that name was a mock. It was like somebody was trying to insult the idea. It was actually a scientist named Fred Hoyle, very famous scientist, very bright guy. Anybody here of Cambridge University in England, University of Cambridge, like top tier university? He was the head of the Institute of Theological Astronomy at Cambridge. And he refused to accept the idea. He was saying, what, you want me to accept the idea that the universe just started in a Big Bang? So he was trying to be insulting of it. And that term was what actually stuck. Einstein didn't call it the Big Bang. Hubble didn't call it the Big Bang. The name Big Bang came because Fred Hoyle was trying to insult the idea. And that was kind of the flashy term that then got stuck to this concept. Okay. And Fred Hoyle actually came up with an idea called the steady state theory, because you couldn't argue that the universe was expanding anymore. Hubble had shown that physically. Right? Just like, hey, I see Brother Hassan Zini. You can't argue with me that Brother Hassan Zini is not here because I see it. So you couldn't anymore argue that the universe was expanding. But maybe you could argue that it didn't have a beginning, because that's the real problem for atheists. That the universe is expanding isn't a huge problem. The real problem is that the universe had a beginning, because then it must have had a beginner to begin it. So Fred Hoyle, like I told you, very smart guy, comes up with this idea called the steady state theory. What is the steady state theory? Well, imagine that space is expanding. Then the stars would kind of go further and further apart, right? The universe would become more dilute. Does anybody know what that word means, dilute? Like if I have, a sugar solution, water mixed with sugar, and it tastes very sweet, and I add more water, well, now there are less sugar molecules in every gulp, it tastes less. I eat more water, now I can barely taste the sugar. Well, if I keep expanding the water, the sugar becomes more dilute. If I keep expanding space, the stars would become more dilute. So Hoyle says, well, okay, fine, the universe is expanding. I can't argue with that. But matter is continuously also being created. So the density of matter stays just the same. So yes, the water is expanding, but somehow the water creates more sugar. And so the lemonade keeps tasting just as sweet. So people didn't accept it easily because it was so revolutionary. And here, this is an article from Scientific American. It says that into the late 1950s, 2/3 of leading American astronomers and physicists believed that the universe had no beginning. Okay? So even then, this was after Hubble in 1929. This was after Einstein in 1915. So I want to show you how recent it is that these discoveries we're talking about are. But And again, I want to remind you of the significance so we don't lose the forest for the trees. An eternal universe needs no creator. Okay, and it's the tension between God as the uncaused cause and the universe as the uncaused cause. And Fred Hoyle, I told you about the steady state theory. Arthur Eddington, he was the one who experimentally proved that light bends and showed that Einstein was correct, that space can curve and that his equations were right. He said philosophically, the notion of the beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. Why is it repugnant? Because if the universe has a beginning, then you need to start believing the creator or at least some cause for that beginning. So even the world's leading physicists didn't want to accept it right away until the 1950s, until the 1960s. Finally, there was essentially no choice. Why was there no choice? Well, I know this stuff looks very complicated, this funny curve here, but I'm asking a very simple question. Do you see the curve? You see the dots on the curve? Everybody here see the curve? Everybody see the dots on the curve? Okay, let me explain what they are. Let's say, who here has an electric stove at their house? Okay, electric stove. Yep. When you turn on the stove, after a while it glows red, right? Now let's say you turn off the stove. Starts getting less red, then it goes dark, but it's still hot, right? Why can't I see it red anymore? Well, because the energy of the light that's causing the heat is still there, but it's below the visible range. I can't see it. It's called infrared light. Okay? So when you have heat, when you have an explosion, when you have a hot stove, it gives off energy. And a very famous physicist named George Gamow, Russian physicist, calculates, he says, if there was a Big Bang, the energy distribution would have to look like this curve. People check his calculations. An American physicist named Jim Peebles checks the calculation and say, this guy's right. If there was a Big Bang, then it would be just like your stove. I can't see the radiation, but if I had a better detector, like an infrared camera, I could say, hey, that stove is hot. Yes, don't touch the stove. And some of you may have, like our stove, it has a little warning. Even when it looks like the eye is completely off, if it's still hot, it lights up with an H. Don't put your hand here because the stove was on, it's hot, but you don't see it anymore. Okay, so they calculate this curve and they say, if there was a Big Bang, the radiation would have to kind of look like this curve if you graph the radiation against like the frequency of the light, all these complex stuff. And there's no other explanation. It's like when your stove is hot at home, there's no other explanation except that that stove was on. I mean, you can't explain it any other way. It's not going to heat itself. So people say, okay, fine, the theory is right. We need to start checking it. So they send up a radio telescope, check, okay, I'm going to check at this frequency. Is there a point there? Yes, there's a point there. Another satellite. Finally, you get to a point where the atmosphere is filtering out the light. Okay, we're going to have to send stuff beyond the atmosphere. Has anybody heard of the Kobe satellite? Okay, and then like Kobe Bryant, it's spelled differently, but Kobe. This was in the 1990s. Then the WMAP satellite was close to the year 2000. It took until about the year 2000 to start measuring, and all of the measurements you see, all the dots you see are measurements that were made to try to check if this is accurate or not. And you see the dots like right on the curve. They match exactly what the theory would have predicted. And so now everybody believes in the Big Bang because there's no other way to get these measurements and get a curve like that. I just wanted to show it to you. It's called the cosmic microwave background radiation. And the people who first discovered the first bits of radiation, one of them is named Penzias, the other is named Wilson. They got a Nobel Prize. Jim Peebles, who calculated the curve, got a Nobel Prize. Again, it was a very big discovery. It sort of proved that the Big Bang happened. And now you saw in 1960, 2/3 of physicists didn't believe it. I don't think you could find a physicist today, one physicist today, who doesn't believe in the Big Bang. Yes.
3.78 black body.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry. Where are you seeing that?
In the middle, right there.
Oh, yes. Perfect. Okay, there's a measurement scale. When you measure temperature, how do we measure temperature? Okay, good. We have Celsius, we have Fahrenheit, right? There's a whole other scale. Somebody say Kelvin? Ah, wonderful. Good for you. Brilliant. The K is for Kelvin. Absolute zero Kelvin means negative 300 degrees Celsius. What Penzias and Wilson and Peebles and Gamow all calculated is that if there was a Big Bang, the leftover heat, just like you have your hot stove, well, first that explosion was really hot, right? And that was, like you say, it caused the whole universe. But that was how many years ago? Well, how long do we believe the universe was created?
8 million years ago.
Yeah, good thought. When was the Big Bang?
5 minutes,
Nice,
6.5.
excellent,
6.5.
13.8.
I was closer.
You were close. The best figure right now that we have, all of our best calculations are that the universe began 13.8 billion years ago in the Big Bang. So when you calculate that explosion, which was very hot, has been cooling for 13.8 billion years, you get that the temperature would be, and this is a calculation, this is not a measure. The temperature would be 2.73 degrees Kelvin.
The estimation.
Yeah, it's a calculation. It's just like if I know that my stove is hot right now and is at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to turn it off and I can calculate for you using something known as Newton's law of cooling that you learn about in college. I can calculate for you 2 hours from now, what will the temperature of that stove be? 20 minutes after I turn it off, what will it be? And I can draw a curve, okay? So Gamow calculates that it's going to be 2.73 degrees Kelvin. That's very cold. It's like a little bit above absolute zero. When they start doing the dots, this is what a body, it's called a black body because it's so cool, it looks black. It's not glowing red anymore. Just like when your eye on your stove cools enough, it no longer looks red, it looks black. Well, they call it a black body, and that was the calculated temperature. When it was measured, turned out to be exactly right. And there's no other way to explain that than the Big Bang. So the bottom line is there is now no argument that the Big Bang existed. So what does it all mean? Well, there are a few quotes here. They're too long. I don't want to bore you. But the idea is that not only space and time, but also matter and energy first arose at the beginning of the universe, before which no such entities could have existed that could have caused the universe to originate. This is very important. Let me explain that again. Scientific materialism, the idea that you don't need the notion of God, says that matter and energy are all that you need to explain everything. This was fine when the universe was eternal, because you had a lot of matter, you have a lot of energy, they've always been there. Okay? But the Big Bang says, no, there was a singularity, and this singularity was the beginning of all matter, of all energy, of all time, of all space. So there was a point where you had no matter and energy to make matter and energy real. They weren't there. It's like the chicken and the egg. Where would they come from? Well, that singularity says that no entities that could have caused matter and energy were there. There was nothing. There was just the singularity. So scientific materialism now wouldn't have a leg to stand on. And so the implications of the Big Bang are, crazy important. And the evidence for the Big Bang was sufficient to change the perspective, for example, of a lot of people, but one name I'll mention to you is Alan Sandage. He was one of the great sort of astronomers of the 20th century. And what happened was it was this conference where people were sitting down to debate all of these ideas. And there was a table for the scientific materialists who were saying, we don't need the idea of God, and a table for religious scientists who were saying, look, all this evidence is now pointing to God. And so Alan Sandage, and I know for you guys, who's Alan Sandage, right? Okay. think of somebody really famous that you know. I mean, somebody that would like, oh my God, look, it's him. That, for people who liked physics, Alan Sandage was like such a guy. Okay? I'm sorry, I don't even want to try to give examples because you'll just make fun of me. Because I'd say, hey, it's Madonna, hey, it's Elvis. I know that that's not right anymore. Who's really famous now?
Michael Jackson.
Okay, Michael Jackson. Okay, we can all agree. Michael Jackson. Okay, so Alan Sandage was like the Michael Jackson of observational astronomy.
Oh, that's actually.
So Alan Sandage walks onto the stage, and everybody's looking for him to go to the table where the other scientific materialists are, and he walks over to the table that the theists, the believing scientists are, and he sits down, and everybody's jaw drops. Because Alan Sandage was not, it was known that he was not a believer in God. And he says, look, this data, the presence of a creation event, I have to change my mind. How can I not? And that wasn't just one case. I mean, there were many such cases. I'm just sort of giving you a case that people talk about, but that it lends credence to my belief that there is some design put into this universe, that it supports a theistic belief. And I want to read to you this quote by Robert Jastrow. He worked at the Goddard Space Institute in NASA, and he published a very popular book. It was called God and the Astronomers. And he made the same points, is that, look, these discoveries have totally changed the landscape. And I know if you're taught the Big Bang at school at all, you're not going to get this perspective on it. But I'm trying to tell you, this isn't my perspective. It's not because I'm a believing Muslim that I'm putting this spin on the Big Bang. This is what scientists themselves were saying, but you're just not going to be taught it in school because we don't teach religious stuff at school, okay? But he said, in concluding his book, he said it is and he, by the way, is not a believer. He's an agnostic. He says, I'm not really decided on the fact. Says it's an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. Does everybody know what the word theologians means? It means religious people. Theology is the study of religion. So this was an exceedingly strange development. This whole Big Bang, and that the universe had a beginning and therefore it must have had a creator. Unexpected by all but the theologians. They have always accepted the word of the Bible. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The development is unexpected because science has had such extraordinary success in tracing the chain of cause and effect backward in time. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. The story that I've told you, imagine you're an atheist, it's ending like a bad dream. This has gone completely against what you would have expected. And he said, he has scaled, meaning the scientist, the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. The religious people for centuries have been telling you God created the heavens and the earth. And you guys for 2,000 years have been saying, no, science tells us different. Well, you can't do that anymore. And for the scientific materialist atheist, this has ended like a bad dream. And when you asked me, didn't somebody try to prove it? Somebody here asked me. Don't know if they got bored of me and left or what happened, but somebody asked me, okay? Yes, they did try to prove it. The man on your left is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. If you study Islamic philosophy, he is about the most famous Islamic philosopher there is. He lived in the 11th century. So say 1,000 years, roughly.
Not the Imam al-Ghazali.
Not our current Imam al-Ghazali from Azhar, another brilliant mind, but Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is much bigger name. Okay? He wrote a very famous book called Ihya Ulum-ud-Din, Revival of the Religious Sciences. He was very bothered that his contemporaries, the Islamic philosophers, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, if you've heard that name, Al-Farabi, they were being very influenced by Greek thought. And remember, Greek thought said that the universe was eternal, static, unchanging. And therefore, maybe it doesn't need a creator, but of course they were religious men. They said God created the universe. Well, what do we do with, how do we reconcile this? Well, we coming up with all sorts of ideas. He said, why are we doing this?
And he wrote another book called Hathout al-Falasifa. Hathout in Arabic means nonsense, the nonsense of the philosophers. So he's kind of criticizing these guys. So he writes a book called Ihya Ulumuddin. In it, he presents an argument which today is known as the Kalam argument. Kalam in Arabic means talk, like in Egyptian, it means, but back then it meant religious philosophy, philosophical thinking. And he presented an argument that said, whatever has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the conclusion is the universe has a cause. Can everybody follow the logic there? This is known as deductive reasoning. When you get more fancy in the science of logic, they'll tell you this is known as a modus ponens argument. Don't worry about the terms, but it's very easy. If I say every Friday I eat fish, that's the first premise. Today is Friday, that's the second premise. What's the conclusion? I'm going to be eating fish today. That's all there is to it. So he says, whatever has a beginning has a cause. Anybody argue with that? No, we can't argue with that. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. People said, well, we can argue with that. The universe has no beginning. The universe is eternal. Why would you say the universe has a beginning? So he starts trying to put logical arguments that, well, if the universe has a beginning, if the universe is eternal, then something must have caused this. You have to go back infinite in time, infinite causation, he tried a philosophical argument. He couldn't prove it. One of the most famous Christian thinkers who lived about 5 centuries later, his name is Thomas Aquinas, became a saint called Saint Thomas Aquinas. Basically picked up the ideas of Al-Ghazali and made the same argument. But again, he couldn't prove it. Premise number 2, that was their reason. They said, if you deal with infinities, if you say the universe is infinitely old, you run into absurdities. Everybody know what the word absurdity is? So how can what time are we? How late am I running? How bad am I doing?
11:59. Do you have to go downstairs?
I actually have to leave here by about 12:15. So I'll leave. Thank you. Okay, one. Let me try to demonstrate to you the sort of reasonings they use.
Would we be able to accommodate a few questions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Inshallah. That infinities lead to absurdities. That because they couldn't prove number 2 that the universe has a beginning. They tried to reason number 2. Say, look, it makes sense. The universe must have had a beginning because if you say it's infinitely old, you run into absurd things. So let me give you an example. Who here knows what the natural numbers means? The natural numbers mean just the counting numbers. When you study a little more math, they'll tell you the natural numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4. How many natural numbers are there? Infinite number, right? Any number you give me, I can give you one more. 1,023,000,023, I'll say, oh, hey, 1,024,000,000. Okay, doesn't stop. So the natural numbers are an infinite set. Okay, now let's say I decide that I'm going to subtract from them all the odd numbers. So imagine all the natural 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm going to take all the odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7. I'm going to take them away. How many odd numbers are there? An infinite number. If I take away all the odd numbers, what do I have left? I have an infinite. I have 2, 4, 6, 8, an infinite number. So I've just taken infinity minus infinity. I still get infinity. That's absurd. Because if I take 5 minus 5, I get 0. If I take 23 minus 23, I get 0. But now, if I take an infinite number minus an infinite, I still get an infinite number. And, and you can, so infinity minus infinity equals infinity, right? We just showed it. But let's say, instead of that, I'm going to take all the numbers above 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, when I take all the natural numbers and I subtract all the numbers above 3, how many of those are there? How many numbers are there above 3? Infinite number, right? Infinity at the top, all the natural numbers. Infinity at the bottom, 4, 5, 6. Now subtract those. What do I have left?
Infinite.
No, 1, 2, and 3, right? Because I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Starting from 4, I'm going to subtract. All of them go except 1, 2, 3. Now I've shown that infinity minus infinity equals 3. But hey, you just told me infinity minus infinity equals infinity. So he said, hey, this is the sort of problem you run into when you start saying things like the universe is infinitely large. This was how they tried to prove it. So nobody had a problem with the logic of the Kalam argument. And it's called the Kalam argument, by the way, because one of the most famous philosophers of religion alive today, William Lane Craig, who studied philosophy, and he called it the Kalam argument in honor of Al-Ghazali, because Al-Ghazali was the first person who developed that argument. Nobody had a problem with the logic. Nobody was saying, Al-Ghazali, you messed up your logic. They were saying, Al-Ghazali, your second premise, we don't accept. We don't accept that dealing with infinities causes absurdities, therefore the universe can't be infinitely old and must have had a beginning. Well, now, we don't need to speculate about it anymore. We know the universe had a beginning. So premise number 2 has now been proved by the Big Bang Theory. Okay? And I don't mean the TV show, The Big Bang Theory. I mean the physics Big Bang Theory. So the Kalam argument now stands. It has been revived. And one of the people reviving it is William Lane Craig, this religious philosopher that I told you about. And he has written a book called The Kalam Argument. And so that is why the Big Bang is so significant. Okay? So I've stood up here for an hour and tried to make an argument for you that you're going to hear things about science, that science clashes with belief in God. That is no longer true. Science now very, very, very strongly supports a belief in God. The Big Bang is just one example. It's a very nice example because it's easy for me to bring it across to you, but I could give you a lot of examples. It's a nice example because you see verses in the Qur'an that predicted things about the Big Bang Theory that would have been impossible for a man living in the Arabian desert in the year 600 to have known about. Okay? But in any case, it is one example out of many, many, something called the fine-tuning of the universe. It turns out that this wasn't just some explosion like when a bomb goes off and everything's a mess all over the place. No, it turns out that this had to be a very, very precise explosion, fine-tuned explosion. The fine-tuning of the universe is, again, almost a lockdown proof that there's no way this universe could be other than designed. It had to be very carefully designed, in fact. So it goes to the question then, so why doesn't everybody believe? What I'm saying is so straightforward. Why doesn't everybody believe? Well, the best answer I can give you is George Wald. George Wald was a professor at Harvard. He won the Nobel Prize in 1967 for his discoveries in biology, in physiology and medicine. And the best answer I can give you is because some people just don't want to believe. It's as simple as that. No matter what evidence you give them, and the Quran mentions exactly that. It doesn't matter what evidence you show them, they still won't believe. Most people are not as honest as George Wald. He was very honest. He looked at the origin of life. Could it have come about by accident? And he realized it is impossible. And this isn't some hack off the street. This is a guy who won the Nobel Prize in biology. But he said, I will not believe that philosophical. What he meant by that is that life was designed. I will refuse to believe that. Okay? Because I don't want to believe in God. Therefore, I have chosen to believe, therefore I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation arising to evolution. So I know as a scientist it's impossible, but I don't want to believe in God, but I don't want to believe in God so much that I have decided to believe in what I know is impossible to believe. Okay, that's the best answer I can give. Because if you look at it on logical grounds, it becomes almost impossible to not believe in God. And you're not going to learn this at school for a lot of different reasons, but also because school is about 50 years behind the cutting edge. And fine-tuning is stuff that's the last 20, 30 years. And when you go to school now, you're not going to learn quantum mechanics. We discovered quantum mechanics in the late 1920s. In 100 years, it still really hasn't even made it to the school board. Okay, let me stop here and take questions for 10, 15 minutes, and then I need to be on my way. Yes, you haven't asked anything, or are you just stretching?
No, I'm not.
Oh, there you go.
Some people believe that the universe is like created with like random quantum physics, vacuums and stuff, saying that nothing is created from nothing, so I don't understand that.
Yes, so there are,
Those are theories, they're not proven.
no, they are theories, they are not proven. The explanation is, it requires quantum mechanics, but, people raise that sort of objection, saying, well, if you, Einstein's equations tell us this is a lie. Okay? When you follow it back, Penrose and Hawking said there has to be a singularity. But there's an assumption underlying that Einstein's equations are always valid under all conditions. General relativity is always valid. People said, but quantum mechanics leaves you a little loophole, that at a singularity, general relativity breaks down. So maybe there's a loophole out of the argument I just presented. That was the case until 15 years ago. A very famous set of physicists, you want me to give you a name so that you know that it's real, Andrei Vilenkin, Russian physicist, proved the Vilenkin theorem. And the Vilenkin theorem said, even taking quantum mechanics into account, you cannot escape a singularity. The universe had to have had a beginning. How could something arise out of nothing? The only way it arises out of nothing is what the old philosophers used to call creation ex nihilo. Ex is Latin from, nihilo means nothing. Okay? And the scientists used to criticize the religionists, saying, you're asking us to believe in creation ex nihilo. And we can't believe that because nothing arises from nothing. We have something called the law of conservation of matter. Has anybody learned that in physics in school, conservation of matter?
Oh, yeah.
You okay, law of conservation of matter. But it turned out that's wrong. How did it turn out that's wrong? What is the most famous equation in physics? If I ask you, name me the world's most famous physics equation. Thank you, E equals mc squared. What does that mean? It means energy is mass times the speed of light squared. That was Einstein's famous discovery in 1905. That was that matter and energy are actually the same thing. To us, they look very different. Like that, I have this kid, and I have energy, fire, that's energy. They're not the same thing. Einstein showed they are the same thing, and you can change energy into matter. So matter can arise spontaneously if I have enough energy. We now use that in the lab all the time. Okay? When it was first discovered, people, I mean, this is a major revolution, that energy and matter are the same thing, and you can change one into the other. That's how atomic bombs were made by me. After Einstein discovered this, he realized, hey, I could take the atom, split it, and turn that matter into energy. But initially, again, people didn't believe it, but it is true, and we actually use it in the lab now to create particles of energy. Anybody ever hear of a PET scan in medicine? Some person X had a PET scan. PET is positron emission tomography. Positrons are bits of matter created from energy. Energy turned into matter. So if God is the source of ultimate energy, that energy can simply be condensed into matter. That is the only reasonable explanation we now have, that matter could arise from nothing. People tried to squirm out of the conclusions, saying, well, quantum tunneling and quantum mechanics can give you these fluctuations without energy. The Vilenkin theorem proves that no, it cannot. The universe had to have had a beginning. I know that explanation is way, way above, what we're trying to do in this lecture, but since you asked, I felt I had to give you an honest answer.
That makes sense.
Okay, but if that answer is not understandable now, but at least know that isn't.
That makes sense.
I want to just say something. Doesn't that make like the people who are atheists and also like physicists and like believe in like that the whole Big Bang theory and whatnot, doesn't that make them mad? Because like it's very clear in front of you that they're the creator, but why do you choose not to believe it? Doesn't that make you insane? He was the honest man. He said, I just refuse, I don't want to believe in God, so I'm gonna decide to believe in something I know is impossible. It doesn't make you crazy, it just makes you, you just, and the Qur'an says that. It says you present them with all evidence and they will still refuse to believe. Some people are just bent on not believing. But
On the other hand, like I told you, this stuff has changed a lot of minds. Alan Sandage being an example. The world's best known atheist, who has, everybody looks stuff up on there. I'm a dinosaur. Okay, I don't, I just switched from a flip phone a year or two ago. So I don't do very much, but can somebody look up for me a book called There Is a God while I answer another question?
Oh, Mr. G had a question.
Yes, he's the one back here. I want to give the young people first, and then, yes.
Who's the biggest scientific atheist?
Who's the biggest scientific atheist? There's a group called the New Atheists. If I had to pick one name, I would say Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is professor of scientific communication and biology at Oxford University. And he was a big proponent that evolution shows us we don't need a God. Evolution is a whole nother talk. Evolution is not one other talk. Evolution is another 10 talks. But there are huge problems with evolution, huge issues. So if you want one name, Richard Dawkins. If I were to give you a second name, has somebody looked up There Is a God, the book?
Yeah,
Who wrote it?
what's his name?
What's his name?
Pardon, 1 second. Anthony Flew?
Yeah, Anthony Flew, Sir Anthony Flew. So Sir Anthony Flew, and when you look at that picture, can you tell me what the title actually says?
There is no another, it's like scratched out. It's like there is
Yes,
a-
so when you look at the picture of the book, he wrote, "There is no God," then he scratched out the no and writes, "There is." That's what's on the cover of the book. The biggest atheist philosopher of the 20th century, his name was Sir Anthony Flew. Sir, because he was such a huge scientist, he received the knighthood in England. Sir Anthony Flew, his articles on atheism were the most researched thing in libraries. You didn't have the internet, so you couldn't say this was the thing that was most downloaded. When the internet first came in debates about religion, his articles were the first download. Topmost in terms of people who looked up religious stuff. He wrote a very famous article called Theology and Falsification, etc., etc. I won't bore you. Suffice it to say, if you wanted to pick one name in the philosophy world, it would be Anthony Flew. When Anthony Flew saw this evidence, plus the stuff I haven't talked about, fine-tuning, he changed his mind. And he wrote a book going from there is no God to there is a God. And he said, I can't in good conscience anymore continue to be the leading voice of atheism. I declare that I believe in God. The world went nuts. I know you guys don't remember and can't even imagine that would, they ate him alive, the atheists. They said he was crazy. They said, whatever. Sir Anthony Flew has gone senile. He's getting close to death, so he's afraid of dying. And so he responded in a very, very coherent way to show that, number one, he's not senile, he's not crazy. And he said, I know you're saying this because, I'm now in my early 80s and I'm afraid what's going to happen to me in the hereafter. Well, I said, I believe in God, but I'm telling you, I don't believe in a hereafter. So I have nothing to be scared of. But the scientific evidence tells me I need to believe in God. This was the same way of thinking that initially led me to believe there is no God, but with the new science, I can't believe that anymore. So he wrote this very famous book called There Is No, scratched out, There Is a God, and he was the leading voice of atheism. So if you want me to give you a couple of names, Richard Dawkins and Anthony Flew. Yes.
Like going back to the evolution thing, like it doesn't make sense since like Prophet Adam is like basically like first human, right? On Earth. Wasn't he like taller? Like he was really tall, like a giant.
Ah,
like,
yes,
acting,
yeah.
like, wouldn't we evolve from that and then like
Yes, okay, so this, you asked a wonderful question, and I have a whole thing about how hadith is misunderstood and misused. There is a hadith that says the Prophet Adam was 90 cubits tall. This is a cubit. Okay, this length to this length is a cubit, and that human beings have been getting shorter and shorter. I myself do not accept that the Prophet said this, because one of the ways to judge if the Prophet said something or not is if he says something that's objectively false, then you have to say somebody misunderstood or misquoted. I think it's metaphorical, not physical, because we know human beings are getting taller, not shorter. But that's a whole thing about how hadith is misused and misunderstood. That's a perfect example of that. And I have developed a whole course for young people about hadith and how to deal with hadith and so on. Yes, young lady.
So you know how they said that the people were really tall?
Uh-huh.
I have this history project on how they built the pyramids,
Yeah.
and they believe that there was aliens. So could they have just been like the tall people?
Well, okay. Very nice idea. No, they could not have been the tall people. Why could they not have been the tall people? Because it actually turns out, this is going to be a hard explanation, but let's say I double my size. Okay, let's say right now, I just double my size.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just imagine.
Ish.
Okay, I'm just, like you put me on a Xerox machine and said enlarge by 100%, and boom, I'm double the size.
Gotcha.
What will my weight do?
Double.
No,
What?
No. no.
Decrease.
Because if you take a sphere, let's say take a ball, you get a ball that is twice as big when I measure like the diameter of a sphere, you know, from end to end. If I get a ball that is twice the diameter, what's its volume? 8
Same.
times the volume.
Oh.
If the diameter doubles, the volume is 8 times. So if my measurements double, my volume and my weight go up by 8 times.
Okay.
But the cross-sectional area of my muscles to carry that weight goes up only by 4 times. So my weight goes up by 8, my muscle area goes up by 4. You can show that you can only do so much of that before the muscles and the bones collapse under the weight. Okay, so you can actually calculate theoretical limits that if I'm still going to be made of bone and muscle, I can only be so big. And it turns out that so big is less than twice as big. If we were more than twice as big as we are right now, we wouldn't be able to have this form. Okay, our muscles and bones would not support that structure, which is another reason that hadith can't be accurate.
So
So God knows best.
that just means Egyptians were strong.
Well, no, Egyptians had reps. Yes, of course they were strong. As an Egyptian, well, of course they were. Yeah. But they used reps. Yes.
So widely believed by Muslims that humans used to be so much taller than.
Well, because there's a hadith. Because if you look in do everybody know what hadith means?
Yeah.
Hadith means a saying of the Prophet. There's a reported saying of the Prophet that Adam used to be 90 cubits. This was 1 cubit. It's longer than a foot. And that human beings are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And because this exists in hadith books, people believe it. And now we're stuck because my science tells me there's no way, not just my science, not these theoretical calculations. We have tools. We know how tall people were 5,000 years ago. We have skeleton remains. Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, Peking man, Java man, all of these ancient, humanoids. And we know that humans have been getting taller and taller and taller, not shorter and shorter and shorter. So what's my way out? Well, my way out is something that people have forgotten about. How do you accept or reject a hadith? Somebody comes and says, Prophet Muhammad said X, Y, and Z. Now I need to decide, did he really say it or not? Peace be upon him. Well, what people do is they look at the chain of transmission. Who told you Prophet Muhammad said, well, this person said this, he said it according to this, he said, and the scientists of hadith did a wonderful job in getting these chains of transmission and saying that if you say A said to B and B said to C and C said to D, and they're all reliable people, I'm going to believe it. Just like, if Sister Naveen comes to me and says, well, Brother Hassan said this and Brother Hassan said that, so on. So if it's a reliable chain and I trust all these people, I'll believe it. So they made all these chains that they said, this is reliable. Other chains weren't reliable. Why weren't they reliable? Because, for example, they say, Brother Hassan said to Sister Naveen, that's the chain. But I can prove that Sister Naveen was born after Brother Hassan, God give him long life, passed away. Well, then there's no way that she says, well, I heard from, no, you couldn't have heard because you weren't even born. That chain is faulty. I reject that hadith. There's a mistake somewhere. This is known as the isnad or the chain of the hadith. That's how you accept if the hadith is right or not. what people forgot is that the old scholars also said you had to look at the content of the hadith. If the content doesn't make sense, even if it has a good chain, then you can't accept that hadith. How do you know that the content doesn't make sense? Let's say it goes against the Qur'an. Let's say it's factually wrong. This hadith is factually wrong. Humans haven't been getting shorter, they've been getting taller. So that's called the matn of the hadith. If the matn is also not sound, then you also don't accept it. Okay? But people have sort of forgotten that and they ignore that. So yeah, okay, I see I have a lot of questions. I don't want to keep going with this. Yes, young lady.
So, you know how like the Big Bang Theory was proven in the Qur'an, and then it's kind of more relevant, my question would be more relevant towards evolution. But if so many scientific things were proven in the Qur'an, what did the Qur'an say about like dinosaurs and apes?
Okay, so yes, evolution, I'm gonna,
We make that a separate.
well, that would have to be a separate 10 talks. Like I said, I'm happy to jump into evolution with you. Evolution is, the Quran doesn't talk about dinosaurs. It talks about apes, but not in a biological evolution sort of way. It just mentions that, you know, apes exist. It just acknowledges that there's such a thing as apes. Evolution is used in very different ways by different people. The theory of evolution, that we all started from one simple organism and it branched into more complexity until we became humans, that's known as macroevolution. That's the theory that Charles Darwin came up. Then there's microevolution. Microevolution is like, I have the COVID virus, and they keep telling us, well, the COVID virus has changed, it's mutated to now a new virus. Oh, I took the vaccine last year, that's no good. It's now a new virus, it's evolved. That's microevolution. Microevolution, no one has a problem with. Scientifically, religiously, nobody. Macroevolution is a totally different thing. People like Charles Dawkins, the famous atheist philosopher, they believe in macroevolution, and I don't need this stuff for God because evolution exists. Macroevolution is what is taught in school. That theory has a lot of serious holes, a lot of serious gaps. So microevolution is correct. I myself do not believe macroevolution is correct. And that's speaking in a scientific sense, not a religious sense. I don't have a problem with macroevolution in a religious sense, by the way. Maybe God decided to create us by macroevolution. It's like you know what ingredients you need to put in, and then it's going to turn out to be, you know, a chocolate torte after I baked it. It's not going to turn out to be Hungarian goulash. I put in the right ingredients for the right amount of time, and I know the mix. So I don't religiously have a problem if God wanted to put the mix and knew how it would be evolved, and we would then end up with humans after 4 billion years. But scientifically speaking, macroevolution has some serious issues. Yes. Oh my God. Thank you. I am so sorry. Forgive me. My peripheral, you know, when you get old, your peripheral vision goes on you. Yeah.
I don't think it's that important, but
It doesn't, yeah, of course it's important.
and when you mentioned earlier the chicken or the egg,
Yeah.
I was like thinking, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yes, that's one of the problems with macroevolution. Yes, yes, so whenever we inshallah get to talk about that.
I have a question.
Yes, I'm sorry, I ignored you, I'm so sorry.
It says that the Quran said that, like there was a big,
Violent cleavage, yes,
violent
Yeah,
opening or whatever.
yeah.
Then how does that, coincide with that, Allah telling us, you know, that in the Quran that it was created in 6 days?
In stages,
Yes,
yeah,
in stages.
yeah, so that is the sort of evolution of the earth that everybody accepts. So for example, the earth once created, you know, we said, how we put in its resources over a certain amount of time. So for example, early earth had no oxygen, right? No, there's very little dispute about that. The earth wasn't created the way we see it now, except that there were dinosaurs instead of people. The early earth had an atmosphere that was essentially carbon dioxide, methane, and so on, initially not oxygen. The early earth was extraordinarily hot. Then it went through a stage where it cooled down drastically, and they call that the snowball earth. And it was basically like the polar ice caps, but they covered the whole planet. So the earth evolved through a whole variety of stages to its present stage. So that's how I personally reconcile that. that the days of the creation of the earth and the days of the creation of the universe, after they were begun, there was a certain physical evolution.
So are we still part of that
Oh, yeah,
changing?
of course,
earth?
it is
So
still-
is that part of the, it was created in 6 days, like, is that part of it?
that's so that it is as it stands now. Right, but we know that later on, when the Quran says, for example, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, right, the day of judgment, when the sun كُوِّرَتْ, what does كُوِّرَتْ mean? Kawara, Kora, anybody speak Arabic?
Yeah.
What's a Kora? What's a Kora? A ball, it's a ball,
Yeah.
right? So when the sun becomes a ball, well, the sun is already round. How did the ancient theologians understand that verse? They said, when the sun is covered up. When you look at it, you say, but the Arabic doesn't mean covered up. Where doesn't mean covered up? When you say kawar al-ilm as a turban, he spun it into this big ball of a turban on his head, like that picture I had shown you over Ghazali. He has this big ball of a turban on his head. But then you look in the dictionaries and they say, well, that's what it normally means, but in the Quran it means covered up. How can it, why would you say that? Well, because we now know what's going to happen to the sun eventually. Well, in a sense,
Explodes.
it will become a red giant. It will become a giant ball. Okay? What we've observed now, so-called stellar evolution, is that the sun will grow, become a so-called red giant, and it will essentially obliterate and burn the earth. Okay? Don't worry, that's a few billion years away. Okay? It's not happening anytime soon.
Thank you so much. Dr.
Okay,
Chester.
but that's meshes with Quran, and by the way, a couple of verses after that, وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ, and when the oceans boil. And people didn't understand why in the world would the oceans boil if the sun is being covered up. But if the sun is going to become a red giant and the earth will become hotter and hotter and hotter, the oceans will boil. Okay, so there's a lot of neat stuff there. I wish I had time to go into all of it. For you, I told Brother Hassan I'd love to start an Institute of Islamic Science. Yeah, inshallah. Yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
Nobody, no, salam alaikum everyone.